Imagine you're standing in an elevator in downtown Manhattan. The cable looks fine. The machinery hums reassuringly. Everything seems normal. But if you could see through the walls, you'd notice something terrifying. Three separate cables are fraying simultaneously, each one thread away from snapping. And you're on the 50th floor. Welcome to the American economy in 2026. Here's the brutal truth that nobody in Washington wants to tell you. We're not heading toward a crisis. We're already in one. It's just moving in slow motion, like watching a train wreck through molasses. And by the time most people realize what's happening, it will be too late to jump off the tracks. You thought 2008 was bad? That was a single-point failure, a housing bubble that popped in Florida and Nevada and took the financial system down with it. What's coming in 2026 is something far more insidious. A perfect storm of three massive, interconnected disasters happening at once. We're talking about a debt bomb that makes 2008 look like a firecracker at a 4th of July barbecue, an AI bubble inflated with borrowed money and Silicon Valley delusion, and a developing world debt crisis that's quietly strangling 70 countries while threatening to drag down the entire global financial system. The math is brutal. It simply does not work. America's national debt hit $38.4 trillion. We're paying over $1 trillion per year just in interest, more than we spend on Medicare, more than the entire defense budget. AI companies have burned through hundreds of billions in infrastructure, with 95% of businesses getting zero return. And meanwhile, 70 countries are on the brink of default, and when they go down, they're taking us with them. This isn't just another market correction that your financial advisor will tell you to quote zero. This is the great unraveling. And here's the darkest irony of all. We saw it coming. We had time to fix it, and we chose to double down like a drunk gambler at 3 a.m. in Vegas. Buckle up, it's going to get ugly. Let me introduce you to Sarah Mitchell. She's 34 years old, lives in Arlington, Virginia, and works as a mid-level accountant at a federal agency. Sarah makes $67,000 a year. She has a modest apartment, drives a used Honda Civic, and tries to save for retirement. She's doing everything right. Here's what Sarah doesn't know. Last year, through her federal income taxes, she personally contributed approximately $2,847 just to pay interest on the national debt. Not for roads, not for schools, not for defense, just interest. Pure, unproductive interest payments to creditors. That's more than she spent on groceries for 3 months. And here's the kicker. By 2035, Sarah's personal share of interest payments will triple to over $8,000 per year, assuming she keeps her job and the whole system doesn't collapse first. Sarah is unknowingly funding the world's largest Ponzi scheme, and it's about to blow up in her face. If you want to understand how insane our debt situation has become, don't look at the total number. $38.4 trillion sounds abstract, like monopoly money. Look at what we're paying just to service it. In fiscal year 2025, the U.S. government spent $970 billion on interest payments alone. By fiscal 2026, that number crosses the trillion-dollar threshold for the first time in American history. Let that sink in. $1 trillion per year, just in interest. To put this in perspective, that's more than we spend on the entire Department of Education, the Department of Transportation, NASA, the EPA, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security combined. Interest is now the second largest line item in the federal budget, exceeded only by Social Security, and it's growing faster than everything else. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2035, interest payments will hit $1.8 trillion, potentially $2.2 trillion under more pessimistic scenarios that assume we keep doing exactly what we're doing now. Think about that trajectory. In 2020, just 5 years ago, interest payments were $345 billion. They've nearly tripled in half a decade. We're adding $1 trillion to the national debt every 157 days. That's faster than it takes most Americans to pay off a credit card. The debt to GDP ratio now stands at 121% of GDP. Interest as a share of GDP hit 3.2% in 2026, exceeding the post-World War II record. By 2035, it's projected to consume 4.1% of the entire economy. But wait, there's more. President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill added $2.4 trillion to deficits over 10 years. The promised tariff revenues? They might bring in $300 to $400 billion annually, not even one-third of yearly interest payments. Then Trump promised 2,000 dividends to 150 million Americans, costing another $600 billion per year. Congratulations, America. You just elected a leader whose economic plan is to borrow money to pay interest on borrowed money, then borrow more money to give everyone a $2,000 check to celebrate how well we're managing the borrowed money. It's financial inception. It's a Ponzi scheme wrapped in a flag and sold at a rally, and half the country cheered for it. You cannot make this stuff up. We're borrowing money to pay the interest on money we borrowed to pay the interest on money we borrowed in the 1980s to pay for Reagan's tax cuts. This is where the trap snaps shut. The rubber band is stretching, and when it finally snaps, the recoil will shatter every financial assumption you've ever made about retirement, home values, and the American dream. Now let's talk about the other disaster waiting to unfold. And unlike the debt crisis, which built over decades, this one inflated in just 24 months of pure, concentrated delusion. Meet David Chen, a vice president at a Fortune 500 manufacturing company in Chicago. David's smart, MBA from Northwestern, 20 years of experience. In early 2024, his CEO came back from a conference in San Francisco, buzzing with excitement about artificial intelligence. "We need to transform," the CEO announced. "AI is going to disrupt everything." So David got a budget, $15 million for an AI transformation initiative. He hired consultants from McKinsey at $850 an hour. He bought licenses from OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google. He sent his team to training seminars. He installed new systems. 18 months later, what does David have to show for it? A chatbot that still can't process customer returns correctly. An inventory prediction system that was less accurate than the Excel spreadsheet his analyst built in 2019. And $15 million down the drain. David is part of the 95%. He's part of the biggest capital misallocation event since the dot-com bubble, and his board still doesn't know it yet. But they will. Oh, they will. Drive through Santa Clara, California at 2 a.m. on any weeknight. You'll see something strange. Massive data centers rising from the ground like alien spaceships, glowing with an eerie blue-white light, consuming enough electricity to power 50,000 homes. Inside, rows upon rows of NVIDIA H100 GPUs, each costing $40,000, humming away training AI models that 95% of companies can't even figure out how to use. This is the data center that Meta built for $35 billion in just 3 months, ending September 2025. It's beautiful. It's state-of-the-art. It has its own power substation, and it might be producing absolutely nothing of economic value. Microsoft alone spent $35 billion on AI infrastructure in a single quarter. The 5 biggest tech companies, NVIDIA, Microsoft, Meta, Alphabet, and Amazon, are projected to burn through $1.6 trillion on AI by 2029. That's trillion with a T. That's more than the entire GDP of Canada. Here's the problem. Nobody's making any money yet. An MIT report from August 2025 revealed that despite $30 to $40 billion in enterprise investment in generative AI, 95% of organizations are getting zero return on their investment. Zero. Zip. Nada. Nothing. Do you see the problem? We're in the infrastructure phase of a gold rush, where everyone's selling pickaxes to each other, but nobody's found any actual gold yet. It's pickaxes all the way down. The numbers are staggering. AI stocks now account for 1/3 of the S&P 500's total market capitalization. Over 2025, AI-related companies drove 80% of gains in the American stock market. In the first half of 2025, investments in AI made up more than 90% of GDP growth. That's not a diversified economy. That's a bet-the-house casino play on a technology that most people can't even define properly. And the valuations, they're insane. Palantir trades at 180 times estimated earnings. Snowflake sits at 140 times projected earnings. Even NVIDIA, Microsoft, and Alphabet trade at 25 to 30 times forward earnings, propped up by assumptions about future profits that may never materialize. Much of this boom is built on circular financing. OpenAI, valued at $500 billion, triple its October 2024 valuation, is sustained by investments from Microsoft, NVIDIA chips on credit, and data center deals that blur the lines between revenue and equity. It's financial incest. Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan, put it bluntly, quote 5. Translation from banker speak to English. Quote 6. This is not investing. This is financial peer pressure on a trillion-dollar scale. And here's the dark comedy of it all. The tech giants are so confident in AI's future that they're willing to go negative on free cash flow to fund it. Meta and Microsoft are expected to have negative free cash flow after accounting for shareholder returns in 2026. Alphabet will barely break even. Combined depreciation expenses from data center spending jumped from $10 billion per quarter in late 2023 to $22 billion by September 2025, with projections hitting $30 billion by late 2026. Remember the fiber optic bubble of the 1990s? Companies laid millions of miles of cable based on growth projections that never materialized. Those cables sat dark and unused for decades. Some of them are still dark today. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And right now it's rhyming in iambic pentameter. If you're enjoying this descent into economic madness and you want to understand what's coming before it hits your 401k, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments. If you had to choose, would you rather A, lose your job in a slow grinding recession that takes 5 years? B, lose 50% of your retirement savings in a single market crash? C, watch your tax bill triple to pay debt interest while bridges literally crumble? Here's the fun part. In 2026, you might get all three at once. I read every comment, so tell me, do you think I'm being too pessimistic, or am I not being pessimistic enough? Because judging by the numbers I'm about to show you, I'm actually being charitable. Now let's talk about the third cable that's fraying, the one that most Americans aren't even watching. While America plays financial chicken with trillion-dollar deficits and Silicon Valley chases AI mirages, there's a third catastrophe unfolding that will drag everyone down with it. The developing world is drowning in debt, and there's no lifeline coming. Let me take you to Nairobi, Kenya, in July 2024. Walk down Moi Avenue in the city center. You'll see burned-out cars, shattered storefronts, broken glass crunching under your feet, and bloodstains on the pavement where protesters clashed with police. Over 50 people died in these streets. Another 300 were injured. What sparked this violence? Not a coup, not ethnic conflict, not a terrorist attack. Tax increases. The Kenyan government, drowning in debt that consumed 60% of government revenues, tried to raise taxes to make interest payments to foreign banks in London, New York, and Frankfurt. The Kenyan people said no. They took to the streets. The government shot them. The IMF, sitting in its air-conditioned headquarters in Washington, D.C., issued a carefully worded statement calling for fiscal responsibility and restraint on all sides. You cannot make this stuff up. People died so that Deutsche Bank could get its interest payment on time. Here are the numbers. 70 countries are at risk of debt distress. Global public debt reached $102 trillion in 2024, with developing countries holding $31 trillion. Less than one-third of total debt, but growing twice as fast since 2010. In 2024, 61 developing countries spent 10% or more of government revenues just on interest. Some spend 23% of export revenues paying foreign creditors. For context, post-W1 Germany's debt servicing was capped at 5%. We gave Hitler's Germany better terms than we're giving Kenya today. The UN estimates that 3.3 billion people live in countries that spend more on debt interest than on education or health combined. Developing countries paid $25 billion more to creditors in 2023 than they received in new loans, a negative net transfer for the second consecutive year. And the mechanisms to fix this? They're broken. The G20 Common Framework, designed to help countries restructure their debt, isn't working. Countries like Sri Lanka were considered, quote, 8 to qualify right before they collapsed. Private creditors refuse to participate because they want their money. China, now a major creditor through the Belt and Road Initiative, plays by its own rules and won't coordinate with Western institutions. Interest costs for developing nations hit $921 billion in 2024, a 10% increase from 2023, while their economies stagnate and their populations suffer. Meanwhile, U.S. interest rates remain elevated. Real U.S. interest rates average 1.5% in 2025 to 2026, a massive swing from negative 1.2% between 2010 and 2019. For developing countries borrowing in dollars, this has been a death sentence. And here's the brutal truth that Americans need to understand. When these economies collapse, they don't collapse in isolation. They trigger migration crises that show up at our southern border. They create political instability that requires U.S. military intervention. They produce humanitarian disasters that dominate our news cycles. And ultimately, they come knocking on the doors of the very developed nations that created this system in the first place. Now we're getting to where it gets really dark, because these aren't three separate problems. They're three fuses on the same bomb, and they're all burning toward the same explosive center. History offers us a brutal lesson. In 1720, the South Sea Company in Britain and the Mississippi Company in France collapsed simultaneously. Two bubbles, two countries, interconnected finance. The result? Economic depression and political chaos for decades. Now imagine that with nuclear weapons, AI-powered trading, and a global economy where Lagos affects Los Angeles in milliseconds. We're repeating 1720 with 21st century speed and 19th century regulations. Here's how the convergence happens. Pension funds get nervous about U.S. bonds. Bond yields creep up. Interest payments jump from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. Meanwhile, AI investments fail to deliver. Tech stocks correct. Consumer spending drops. Unemployment rises. Tax revenues fall. The deficit explodes. As tech stocks decline, wealth evaporates. Consumer spending drops. The U.S. economy slows. Unemployment rises. Tax revenues decline. The deficit worsens. Interest payments consume more budget. As U.S. rates stay elevated, developing countries can't refinance dollar debt. Defaults cascade, not one or two, but dozens. The IMF lacks resources for 70 simultaneous bailouts. Capital flees to U.S. treasuries and gold. Gold surges from $2,600 to past $5,000 as economist Komal Srikumar predicted. The dollar becomes volatile. Foreign holders question whether U.S. bonds are truly "9." The Buffett indicator sits at 225%. Anything over 160% is dangerously overvalued. The CAPE ratio sits around 40 versus a long-term average of 17. The only other times it exceeded 40 were 1929 and 1999. You cannot have three simultaneous crises without them feeding each other in a doom loop. This isn't one fire, it's three fires providing oxygen to each other. Let's zoom out to the geopolitical chessboard, because while America is consumed by debt and bubble management, the global power structure is being rewritten in real time, and most Americans are too distracted by TikTok to notice. China is watching with barely concealed satisfaction. While the U.S. burns $1 trillion yearly on interest and Silicon Valley chases AI mirages, China plays differently. It's the world's manufacturing hub, controls critical supply chains, and holds $775 billion in U.S. treasuries it can weaponize. As 70 countries near default and the IMF can't help, China steps in through Belt and Road. No democracy lectures, just infrastructure, loans, and influence. The developing world learns they have options beyond Washington. Europe barely holds on. France, Germany, and Italy project 0.8 to 0.9% growth in 2026. That's stagnation. Russia, despite sanctions, proved more resilient than anticipated. Here's the trap. If the U.S. enters crisis in 2026 to 2027, its global power projection collapses. Military spending gets squeezed, alliances fray. Into that vacuum steps China, offering authoritarian capitalism without human rights questions. The Western-led, rules-based international order that's existed since 1945 doesn't end with a bang. No nuclear war, no dramatic collapse. It ends with a whimper as the economic foundation crumbles and nobody has the resources to maintain it anymore. American troops start coming home not because of an isolationist policy, but because we literally can't afford to keep them deployed. The Pax Americana fades into history, not because of military defeat, but because of financial incompetence. The great irony? We're not losing to external enemies. We're losing to our own fiscal recklessness, our own speculative bubbles, our own inability to do basic math and live within our means. The Romans didn't fall to the barbarians because the barbarians were stronger. They fell because Rome had already hollowed itself out from within. We're watching the same movie, just with better special effects and smartphones. So here we are, standing at the edge of the cliff in 2026. Three simultaneous crises, all interconnected, all accelerating toward collision. Sarah Mitchell in Arlington is about to see her tax bill triple. David Chen in Chicago just got laid off. And in Nairobi, another protester is being tear-gassed for daring to question why his country is choosing Citibank over schools. What happens next? There are two possible futures, and only one of them is survivable. Future A, the Great Reset. In this scenario, policymakers wake up and take radical action. The U.S. implements real fiscal reform, cutting spending, raising taxes on high earners. Congress passes bipartisan deficit reduction. The Fed threads the needle on rates. Tech companies find AI applications that work. The international community creates actual debt restructuring for developing nations. We get a painful but manageable correction. Markets down 20 to 30%. Shallow recession. Unemployment hits 6.5% for 18 months, then recovers. Sarah Mitchell keeps her job. David Chen finds work after 8 months. The probability? Optimistically 25%. It requires unpopular choices in an election year. Future B, the cascade. This is the more likely scenario, and it's significantly darker. This is what happens when no one wants to be the adult in the room. The AI bubble pops first, probably triggered by a major company admitting in an earnings call that their AI investments won't generate positive returns for years. NVIDIA drops 40%. The sell-off spreads. Tech stocks, which drove 80% of gains in 2025, lead the market down 35% from peak to trough. That's not 2008 level, but it's 2000 level, and 2000 took 3 years to bottom and 7 years to recover. Wealth evaporates overnight. $8 trillion in paper wealth just gone. Consumers feeling poor and scared about job security stop spending. Consumer spending, which drives 70% of U.S. GDP, drops sharply. Growth stalls. The economy tips into recession by Q3 2026. But unlike normal recessions where the Fed cuts rates to stimulate growth, this time is different. Interest rates can't go back to zero because inflation is still hovering around 3%, and the government needs to keep selling bonds to fund that trillion-dollar annual interest payment. The Fed is trapped. They can't save you this time. Unemployment rises to 7%, then 8%, then 9%. Tax revenues collapse. Interest payments surge past $1.5 trillion. Sarah Mitchell gets furloughed. Developing countries default in waves. Kenya, Pakistan, Ghana, Ethiopia. The IMF is overwhelmed. Geopolitical instability surges as U.S. influence wanes. By late 2026, we're in full crisis that makes 2008 look mild. Years of stagnation, unemployment near 10%, social unrest, political radicalization, fundamental questions about the American model. The probability? Realistically, 60 to 70%. This is what happens when you kick the can for decades. Here's the final irony that nobody wants to acknowledge, the truth that keeps me up at night. We're the richest, most technologically advanced civilization in human history, with more resources and knowledge than any society that has ever existed. And we're about to bankrupt ourselves by borrowing money we don't have to buy technology we don't know how to use. While ignoring a debt crisis we absolutely knew was coming because we were too busy arguing about culture war nonsense to focus on basic economics. Future historians, assuming there are any who can afford graduate school after this mess, will study 2026 the way we study the fall of Rome. Not as a mystery, not as a tragedy, but as a case study in how empires commit suicide through sheer fiscal stupidity and political cowardice. The Romans spent themselves into oblivion paying for bread in circuses, while barbarians massed at the gates. We're spending ourselves into oblivion paying for tax cuts and stock buybacks while the foundations rot. The similarities would be funny if they weren't so terrifying. If you found this analysis useful, or if it scared the hell out of you, which it should, leave a comment below. Tell me which future you think we're heading toward. Tell me if you think I'm wrong. Tell me if you think there's a third option I'm missing. I read every single comment. Hit that subscribe button and share this with anyone who needs to understand what's coming, because ready or not, 2026 is here. And this time, there's no bailout coming. The cavalry ran out of money $2 trillion ago. We're on our own. Welcome to the endgame. I hope you're prepared.